My horse lives outside 24/7 in a dry lot herd environment. And that is the best housing I can provide for her given the boarding options within an hour and a half of my house. There are options closer to my house with more space that are beautiful lush green pastures. And I will never put my horse on them because horses are not actually meant to live on pasture, even though it's like the industry gold standard and it's what we have been taught to strive for our horses. And I am going to explain why that is in this video. So if you have a horse that lives on pasture in the summer or maybe year round, but they're tenderfooted and maybe they just can't go barefoot, and you've been told that that's just the genetics of your horse and that's just who your horse is, but you know, like, your horse's feet are a little tender or up and down or a little off all the time. Or maybe your horse has some gut issues. They colic a couple times a year and you don't feel like it's totally normal, but you also have been told that it is normal, so you're just being told to accept it and you're trying to accept it. Or maybe they have bouts of ulcers. Maybe there's some behavioral stuff where your horse seems unnaturally reactive at certain times of the year, or their weight is fluctuating up and down all the time, and it just doesn't feel quite right. If your horse is living on pasture, and they are just not that thriving, healthy horse that you think they should be, the pasture is what you want to look at first. It's important to understand that in our modern world, most pastures are extremely mismanaged. And people think like, oh, if my horse is in a short grass pasture, that's better because they're not going to get too much grass if the grass is short. That is not true. The amount of grass that your horse is eating is not the problem. It's the amount of carbohydrates and sugars. They're called non-complex fibers, NCFs, in the horse nutrition world. When the grass is super short, where the horses are just eating it down all the time and it's barely growing at all, that grass is really stressed. The more stressed the grass is, the higher in NSCs it is. And that is really, really, really bad for our horses. So most pastures that horses live in the United States, in the modern world, aren't big enough to handle the horses, and they're not being rotated properly. So all of those horses are getting way too many simple sugars and carbs that their bodies can't handle. Maybe your horse is on a massive, 50-acre plus pasture, and you're like, that's not my problem, I'm good to go. It's really important to understand the difference between domestic horses and wild horses. When Jamie Jackson, who is like the studier of the wild horse, he goes out and he follows herds around and studies them. He found that wild horses only spend half an hour to an hour on really, really lush green grass at a time before a predator comes along and pushes them off, before another herd comes on and pushes them off, before those horses have to leave to get to water or wherever they're going. Horses in the wild travel a path of many, many, many miles, and they never stay in one place for too long. And often they're up really high in elevations where they are eating lichens and like all kinds of different plants that is not lush green grass. So that mindset and that thought process that wild horses stand around in a field and eat all day is not correct. Domestic horses, and this is what Jamie Jackson has studied and found, domestic horses, even in really big pastures, their water never moves. Where the hay goes, where the food goes, never moves. Typically, they're pretty well protected. Predators don't come in and push them off. They do not have competition with other herds. They do not have the mindset and the need to keep moving, so they don't. They stand around, they gorge themselves on grass. They are not the healthy replicas of the wild horses that we see, and it's not because of their genetics, it's because of their lifestyle. So as we started domesticating horses in the United States, we used them as farm equipment. And we've kind of modeled our horse care off of that ever since, even though there's no reason to do that anymore. A ranch horse was kept with the cows that he worked. A a plow horse was kept in the field next to the other field that he plows. So, these horses were really valuable to the people who owned them. And I do think that cowboys and farmers really, really did love their horses in their own way, and they still do. The mindset that we're going to keep these horses around for 30 years and keep them rideable for 30 years, they couldn't afford to have that mindset. They needed that horse sound and functioning now. That's why we shoe horses. They needed to feed that horse as cheaply as possible, otherwise they wouldn't make any money when they sold their products at the end of the year. It all went back into the horse. So a lot of love for the horse, but not a lot of knowledge on how to care for it. And those horses had a much shorter usable, I don't like saying that because horses are not something for us to be used, but they had a much shorter sound and healthy lifespan than our horses in today's world are capable of having if we know how to care for them right. We don't want a horse on stressed, short pasture. We know that horses aren't meant to stand around and graze all day, but if you put a domestic horse out in a huge field with a couple buddies, they are not going to act like a proper herd. We know better, and it's time to do better. Let me help you understand a little bit more about why it's so harmful to have your horse getting too much sugar from pasture grass. Those NSCs, sugars and starches, are supposed to be absorbed in your horse's foregut. The horse has the stomach and the small intestines, and from the mouth to the small intestines is the foregut, from the cecum to the poop is the hindgut. Those are different digestive properties that have different functions. In the foregut, that is where nutrients are absorbed, and your horse should be able to absorb all of the sugars and starches that they need in the foregut. But if they're getting overloaded and they're getting too much and the foregut can't process all of the sugars and starches that the horse is getting, it gets dumped into the hindgut. The hindgut is where the microbiome lives, all of those super beneficial microorganisms that helps your horse's gut function, that helps them have that continuous digestive process that they need to survive. Your horse's microbiome health and yours is the key to their quality of life. And when a horse gets too much sugar and it gets dumped into the hindgut, those microorganisms can't process it and they start to die. When they die, the body has a huge inflammation response. And the lamina in the hooves, which is what connects the hoof wall to P3, that bone in their hoof, are extremely sensitive to inflammation and they start to stretch and separate. And that's what causes laminitis. This is super important that you understand this. Being fat does not cause laminitis. Is being fat a risk factor? Because if your horse is fat, is there a chance that they're getting way too many sugars that they can't process? 100%. But if your horse is out on pasture and you're watching them and you say, well, he's not overweight, so he's fine, you are lying to yourself. All green pasture is a ticking time bomb for laminitis. Can a horse ever be on pasture in a healthy way? Yes. Let's talk about what that looks like. Mature grasses that are already starting to go to seed are much lower in sugar. Are long, they are starting to dry, they are already going to seed. That is a much more similar diet to what a wild horse eats. Putting your horse out on that for a controlled amount of time can be really, really, really good for them. But once the horses eat that pasture down, they need to be brought off of it, and that pasture needs to be allowed to fully recover and go to seed again. Otherwise, you get into that cycle of stressed high sugar grasses. Really fresh spring grass can be offered as a tiny treat for a horse that has never had a metabolic problem. 20 minutes or less, they love it. Cap it at that. It's really, really important to understand that fresh grass should never be a horse's only source of forage, even though this is really common in the boarding industry, especially if you're looking for a lifestyle where your horse can have access to a herd and live a horse life. But if that fresh grass is that horse's only source of forage all summer, that is a ticking time bomb for laminitis. Unfortunately, these boarding situations are everywhere, and there are a ton of people out there who have their horses in them and think they're doing their best for their horse. I did this. I thought I was doing best for my horse, and he died. Now that I understand and know what I know, my horse lives 24/7 in a dry lot. The really harsh truth, especially now with the price of hay, is that you cannot afford to feed your horse hay year-round. You can't really afford to have a horse. But I want to kind of caveat that by saying horses don't need super high-calorie hay. You do not have to buy those $30 bales of alfalfa. There are cheaper, lower-calorie options out there. And I promise you, it is so much cheaper and more enjoyable to prevent than it is to heal. So, if your horse is out on pasture and getting a significant amount of their diet from pasture grass, they are a ticking time bomb. And it is up to you to advocate for them and start looking for better options, a dry lot or gold standard of all gold standards, a track system or a paddock paradise for them as soon as possible. I specialize in helping people figure out the best situation for them and their horse within the constraints, the very real life constraints that are around them. So if you need help with that, please let me know.